Who is this man trapped in the elevator with me? The elevator doors were already closing when a guy slipped in sideways, hitting the button panel with his shoulder and making half the buttons light up. Sorry, he laughed, pressing the lobby even though it was already lit. He was cute in that approachable way, button-down shirt and khakis like every other office drone in the building. Long night? He asked. The longest, I said, checking my phone again. 3 missed calls from my mom's neighbor. That was basically a code red. I was already panicking when the elevator suddenly hit a stop between the 7th and 6th floors. I hit the lobby button repeatedly while he suggested trying the door open button, but nothing worked. The emergency button made a buzzing sound, but nobody answered. We were stuck. Security must be doing rounds, he said. They'll notice soon. I'm Parker, by the way. Claire, I said, trying to call my mom's neighbor back, but the call wouldn't go through. Come on. Everything okay? Parker asked. My mom is diabetic, I said. Her blood sugar drops at night and she forgets to check it. I usually call to remind her, but I've been stuck at work and now her neighbor's trying to reach me. Can the neighbor help? He asked. She's elderly too, I said, pressing the emergency button again. God, how long until security notices? Hey, it'll be okay, Parker said. We'll get out soon. How far away does your mom live? 20 minutes, I said. If something happens to her because I'm stuck in here, don't think like that, he said. Tell me about her. Maybe talking will help. So I did, because I needed the distraction. I told him how my mom had been diagnosed 5 years ago, how stubborn she was about taking care of herself, how I'd been trying to convince her to move in with me, but she refused to leave her house. That must be really hard, Parker said, being the caretaker. He told me about his own dad who'd had cancer, how he understood my pain. The hardest part is when they won't accept help, he said, like they'd rather struggle alone. Exactly, I responded. She still insists on using the stairs even though her bedroom's on the 2nd floor. At least she moved the bedroom downstairs after the fall, Parker said. I went cold. What? His face changed instantly, realizing his mistake. You said, I thought you mentioned. I never said anything about a fall, I said slowly. You must have, he said, but his voice was different now. No, I said, standing up. I didn't. Parker stood too. You're upset. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking perfectly clearly, I said, backing away. I never mentioned any fall. He was quiet for a moment too long. Lucky guess. Elderly people fall. And you just happened to guess she moved her bedroom downstairs? My heart was racing now. Claire, calm down. Don't tell me to calm down, I said. He was quiet, then smiled, but it wasn't warm anymore. Fine. I know about your mom. I know you visit her every Wednesday and Sunday. I know her neighbor Grace worries too much and calls whenever your mom doesn't answer right away. I know a lot of things. My stomach dropped. You've been watching me. I'm security, he said, pulling a key from his pocket. Night shift. I see everyone who comes and goes. I hear phone conversations in the lobby. I notice patterns. That's not part of your job, I said. I made it part of my job, he said. Every Tuesday and Thursday when you work late, you park in spot B26. You get chai lattes from the lobby coffee shop. You wear that vanilla perfume. Oh my God, I said. This isn't an accident. You stopped the elevator. When you were checking your phone, he said. You didn't even notice. Just like you never noticed me. Let me out, I said. Right now. Your mom's fine, Parker said. Her blood sugar's stable. She had dinner at 6:30 like always. Grilled chicken and vegetables. Very diabetic friendly. My hands were shaking. The level of detail was terrifying. I pay attention to everything about you, he continued. I wanted to know who you were. Your mom's part of you. You're insane, I said. I'm thorough, he said. I've been watching her house tonight through the security camera across her street. She took her insulin like she's supposed to. Checked her levels at 9. She's asleep now. There's no security camera on her street, I said. Not officially, he said. But I installed one last month, just to make sure she's safe when you can't be there. You're welcome. I felt sick. This man had been monitoring my mother, had cameras on her house, knew her medical routine, and I was trapped in here with him. We have all night, Parker said. No one checks the elevators until morning shift at 6. 7 more hours to get to know each other better. He took a step closer and placed his hand on the back of my neck. His fingers pressed against my skin, and every muscle in my body wanted to jerk away, but I made myself stay completely still. My brain was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go in this tiny metal box. I focused on keeping my breathing normal even though my heart was pounding, so hard I could feel it in my throat. I needed to say something that wouldn't make him angry or more aggressive. Parker, I said quietly, like we were still having a friendly conversation about our families. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I kept my eyes on the elevator doors instead of looking at him because I didn't trust what my face might show. Every self-defense class I'd ever heard about flashed through my mind, but none of them covered being trapped in an elevator with a stalker who had the override key. His thumb moved slightly against the back of my neck and my stomach turned over. I needed to get his hand off me without making this worse. My legs started shaking and I realized I could use that. Parker, I need to sit down, I said. My legs are shaking really bad. I wasn't lying about the shaking part. He pulled his hand away finally, and I slid down the elevator wall until I was sitting on the floor with my back pressed against the metal. From down here, I could see the control panel at a different angle. The emergency stop button was still pushed in and glowing red. He had physically stopped this elevator on purpose. This wasn't some random mechanical failure. He had planned this whole thing. I pulled my phone out and pretended to check the time while I opened the voice memo app. My hands were trembling, but I managed to hit record, and then I set the phone down beside my left leg, with the microphone facing toward where Parker was standing. The red recording dot was tiny, but I could see it from this angle. I needed him to keep talking, so everything he said would get captured. Evidence. I needed evidence if I ever got out of here. You were having a bad day, Parker said suddenly. I looked up at him and he was watching me with that same smile that didn't reach his eyes. 6 months ago. You were in the lobby crying and I brought you coffee from the shop. You don't remember, but I do. I searched my memory for any moment like that, but came up completely blank. I would remember a security guard bringing me coffee. I would remember crying in the lobby. The fact that I had zero memory of this moment meant he'd been watching me for half a year without me noticing even once. That's really nice of you, I said carefully. I'm sorry I don't remember. I was probably really upset. He nodded like I'd just confirmed something important to him. You were on the phone with your mom's doctor. Something about her medication doses. I watched you for 20 minutes that day. 20 minutes. He'd stood there watching me cry for 20 minutes. Parker, I said, can you give me some space? I'm feeling really closed in right now. I framed it like I needed air instead of saying I was scared of him. He considered this for a moment and then took half a step backward. It wasn't much, but it gave me a tiny bit more room to breathe. I used the moment to scan the elevator for anything useful. The metal handrail bolted to the wall, the control panel with its buttons and emergency phone, the fluorescent light panels in the ceiling, the inspection slot near the floor that maintenance probably used. Nothing that could help me right now. I picked up my phone and held it near the crack where the elevator doors met. Maybe if I got it close enough to the outside, I could catch 1 bar of signal. The screen showed no service. I moved the phone up and down along the seam, trying different heights and angles. Still nothing. Come on, I thought. Just 1 bar. Just enough to send a text. Parker sat down on the floor across from me and crossed his legs. My dad left when I was 8, he said. My mom worked 3 jobs and I barely saw her. I know what it's like to worry about family, to feel like you're the only one who can keep them safe. His voice had gone soft and gentle, like he was trying to connect with me on some deep level. It made my skin crawl because he was reframing himself as someone who understood me, someone who was protecting me and my mom instead of stalking us. I forced myself to nod along with what he was saying. That must have been really hard, I said. The words tasted wrong in my mouth, but I needed to build some kind of fragile connection with him. Every instinct screamed at me to tell him he was a creep and to let me out of here. But I kept my voice sympathetic and concerned, like I actually cared about his childhood trauma. He kept talking about his mom and how he used to check on her at night to make sure she was breathing, how he would count her breaths until he fell asleep. The level of detail was disturbing, but I made myself keep nodding. Parker reached across the space between us and touched my neck again. His fingers traced along my skin from my ear down to my collarbone. I flinched hard before I could stop myself. My whole body jerked away from his touch and I saw his expression change. I recovered fast and put my hand over his. Too fast, I said quickly. This is all moving too fast for me. We need to take things slower. Can we just talk for now? He pulled his hand back and looked hurt, like I'd rejected him unfairly. While he was processing what I'd said, I studied the control panel more carefully. The emergency stop toggle was a red switch behind the main button panel. The alarm button that hadn't worked when I pressed it earlier. A small inspection slot near the bottom with a metal cover that might open. I memorized every detail in case any of it mattered later. I gestured toward the key still visible in Parker's hand and told him it was making me more nervous to see it, that it reminded me we were actually trapped in here. He looked down at the key like he'd forgotten he was holding it, then considered my words for a long moment before sliding it into his front right pocket. I watched exactly where it went, noting the angle and depth, filing away that his right front pocket was where I'd need to reach if I got any chance at all. The key made a small bulge in the fabric, and I could see the outline of it pressing against the khaki material. Parker settled back against his corner of the elevator and asked what I wanted to talk about to pass the time. I launched into the most boring story I could think of, telling him about my mom's favorite cooking show that she watches every Sunday afternoon without fail. I described the host's annoying voice and how my mom always yells at the TV when contestants make obvious mistakes, going into detail about last week's episode where someone burned their sauce. Parker listened to every single word like I was sharing the secrets of the universe instead of rambling about a cooking competition. His eyes never left my face and he nodded at appropriate moments, asking follow-up questions about what my mom's favorite dishes were. The level of interest he showed in these meaningless details confirmed everything I already knew about how deep his obsession ran. In any other situation, having someone pay this much attention would be flattering, but right now it just made my skin crawl. I kept talking anyway, stretching the cooking show story as long as I could because every minute I kept him engaged was another minute someone might notice the elevator was stuck. When I finally ran out of cooking show material, I shifted tactics and asked Parker what his last name was. I framed it casually, saying I wanted to know more about him for when we got out of here and could maybe grab coffee sometime. His expression changed and he deflected immediately, asking me another question about my mom instead of answering. But the movement made his security badge swing forward on its lanyard, and I caught a glimpse of text printed on the white plastic. I couldn't read it from this distance, but I could see there was definitely a full name there along with his photo and some kind of ID number. I needed to get closer without making it obvious that the badge was what I actually wanted to see. I waited a few minutes and then suddenly grabbed my left calf, making a pained face and telling Parker I had a cramp. I started rubbing my leg and shifted my position, moving from my corner toward the middle of the elevator floor. Parker leaned forward looking concerned and asked if I was okay. I kept massaging my calf and shifted again, getting myself close enough that his badge was now only a couple feet away from my face. The text was small, but I could make it out clearly now in the dim elevator lighting. Parker Devlin, it read, along with a photo that matched his face and an ID number starting with 4729. I committed every detail to memory while continuing to rub my leg and grimace. Parker reached out like he was going to touch my shoulder again, but I flinched back, using the cramp as an excuse. My phone was still on the floor beside me, and I carefully picked it up, angling it at hip height while pretending to check if I had any signal yet. I opened the camera and held it low, pointing it up toward where Parker sat with his badge hanging forward. The angle was awkward, but I managed to frame both his face and the badge in the shot, before tapping the shutter button with my sound turned off. The flash didn't go off since I kept my settings on low light mode. The image was dark when I glanced at it quickly, but clear enough to see Parker's face and read the name on his badge. I felt a tiny surge of something like hope, knowing this evidence might actually matter if I managed to get out of here. I kept my phone in my hand and opened my messages, pulling up a new text to 911. I typed out our building address from memory, added that we were stuck in an elevator between the 7th and 6th floors, and included Parker Devlin's name and ID number from his badge. My description noted his height, the khaki pants and button-down shirt, and the fact that he was building security who had deliberately trapped me here. My finger hovered over the send button, but the signal indicator still showed nothing. I left the message drafted and ready, knowing it would go out the second I got even one bar of reception. Parker was watching me with my phone and asked who I was texting. I told him I was just checking my mom's neighbor's number in case I got signal, which was partially true. He seemed to accept this, and I carefully set the phone down again, making sure the screen stayed dark so he couldn't see what I'd actually been typing. The silence stretched between us, and I knew I needed to fill it with something before Parker decided to move closer again. I suggested we make some ground rules so we both felt safe and comfortable during this situation, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. Parker's expression shifted to something like interest, and he asked what kind of rules I was thinking about. I could tell he was intrigued by the idea, like it was proof I was willing to engage with him instead of just panicking. My first rule was no touching unless I specifically said it was okay, and I watched Parker's face as I said it. He nodded seriously like we were negotiating some kind of business deal, agreeing to the boundary with this performative respect that made me want to scream. But I kept my expression neutral and even managed to look grateful, thanking him for understanding. The whole interaction felt surreal, like I was playing a part in some twisted game where the rules kept changing. I mentioned that I was getting thirsty and asked if he had any water with him. Parker shook his head and said he didn't bring anything, that he'd just been doing his rounds when he saw me getting on the elevator. I started doing the math in my head about how long I could last without water, whether dehydration would become a real problem before morning shift arrived at 6. That was still over 6 hours away, and my mouth already felt dry from stress and talking so much. I pushed the thought aside and pivoted to asking Parker how he'd actually stopped the elevator, framing it as curiosity about the technical details. He sat up straighter, and I could see he was proud to explain his knowledge, describing the override system built into the security panel on each floor. He walked me through exactly how he'd used his master key to access the panel while I was distracted with my phone, then engaged the emergency stop and disabled the call button so it would buzz but not connect. The level of detail he provided confirmed this wasn't some impulsive decision, but something he'd planned out carefully, knowing exactly how to trap someone in here without triggering any immediate alarms. I tried to keep my voice calm and suggested that maybe he could reset the stop to show we could trust each other, that it would prove good faith between us. Parker's face changed in an instant, and his expression went hard like stone. He refused immediately and told me we weren't done talking yet, that he wasn't ready to let me go. The way he said it made my stomach turn because it confirmed he saw this as his choice, his control, his decision about when I got to leave. I needed to try something else, so I shifted position slightly and held my phone up higher along the door seam, moving it slowly up and down to find any spot that might catch signal. Suddenly, one flickering bar appeared on the screen and my heart started pounding so hard I thought Parker might hear it. I realized I had maybe seconds to get a message out before the signal disappeared again, and I had to act fast without making him suspicious. My thumb was already hovering over the send button on that drafted 911 text, and I pressed it while keeping my face neutral and my body angled away from Parker. I watched the status change to sending and felt a surge of hope, but then the signal bar vanished completely, and the message showed as pending. I didn't know if it went through or if it was stuck in my phone waiting for signal, and the uncertainty felt crushing, because this might have been my only chance. To cover what I'd just done, I immediately asked Parker about his favorite street near my mom's neighborhood, making my voice sound interested and conversational. He took the bait completely and started describing the area in detail, mentioning how he liked the corner of Maple and 4th because there was a good view of her front door from there. I memorized that cross street and made a mental note that he'd basically just admitted to staking out my mother's house from a specific location. Parker shifted topics suddenly and asked about my perfume, commenting on how much he loved that vanilla scent, and how he always noticed it when I walked through the lobby. The question made me look down at my purse automatically, and that's when I realized the perfume bottle was in an aerosol can format, which meant it could potentially be useful for something if I got desperate enough. I filed that information away and kept my face friendly while my mind raced through possibilities. I needed to create some physical distance between us, so I proposed a trust exercise where we could sit in opposite corners with our hands visible, so neither of us felt threatened. Parker considered this idea for what felt like forever, studying my face like he was trying to figure out if I had some hidden agenda. Eventually he agreed, and moved to the far corner, while I shifted to the opposite side with my back pressed against the cold elevator wall. From my corner, I asked to see Parker's hands to make sure he was following our rules, framing it like I just wanted to feel safe. He held them up in front of him with his palms facing me, and I noticed small cuts and scrapes on his fingers that looked fresh and raw. The injuries were consistent with recent installation work, which validated his claim about putting up cameras, and made everything feel even more real and scary. Parker started asking questions about my dating life, and whether I had a boyfriend. His tone casual, but his eyes watching me too carefully. I invented a protective boyfriend on the spot who expected me to check in regularly, hoping this would make Parker think someone would notice if I didn't come home tonight. I described this fake boyfriend as the type who worried a lot and always wanted to know I was safe, laying it on thick to create the impression that people were waiting for me. Parker's expression shifted immediately, and he asked to see the last text I sent to this boyfriend, to prove he actually existed. My stomach dropped hard because I didn't have any texts from a boyfriend, and I needed to come up with something convincing in the next few seconds, or he'd know I was lying. I pulled up a text thread with a male coworker named James, and angled the screen toward Parker from a distance, keeping my hand carefully positioned to cover the contact name at the top. The messages were generic enough to pass as boyfriend texts, just stuff about meeting up later and having a good day, nothing that would obviously indicate a work relationship. Parker studied the screen for a long moment and I held my breath, but eventually he seemed satisfied and sat back against his corner of the elevator. My stomach twisted and I pressed my hand against it, making the gesture obvious. I needed to get closer to that control panel, and this was my chance. I told Parker I felt sick, and asked if he could come over and maybe hold my hair back while I crouched down near the wall. His expression shifted to concern, and he stood up quickly, crossing the elevator to kneel beside me. I bent forward with my head down and positioned myself right next to the control panel, making small gagging sounds while my eyes scanned the metal plate covering the emergency systems. Parker's hand landed on my shoulder, and I could feel his thumb rubbing small circles like he was trying to comfort me, which made my skin want to crawl off my body. But I stayed focused on the panel and spotted the emergency stop toggle through a narrow gap where the metal plate didn't quite meet the wall. The toggle was a small red switch about 3 inches behind the panel face, and I could see it was currently in the down position. I memorized exactly where it sat and how the panel attached to the wall with 4 small screws at the corners. This information might not help me at all, but at least I had a plan forming in my head, something concrete to work toward instead of just sitting here terrified. I made a few more fake gagging sounds and then sat back slowly, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. Parker asked if I felt better, and I nodded, telling him the moment had passed. He moved back to his corner, but his eyes stayed on me longer than felt comfortable, like he was trying to figure out if I'd really been sick, or if I was playing some kind of game with him. The silence stretched between us for maybe 30 seconds before Parker's whole tone changed. His voice got harder, and he started talking about everything he'd done for me, listing it all out like he expected me to thank him. He mentioned watching my parking spot to make sure nobody messed with my car, checking the lobby coffee shop's cleaner practices because he knew I got drinks there, monitoring my mom's house to keep her safe when I couldn't be there. His voice got louder with each thing he listed, and I could hear the anger building underneath his words. He said he'd been protecting me for months, and I'd never even noticed him, never said thank you, never showed any kind of appreciation for how much effort he put into caring about my life. I sat very still and kept my face neutral, while my brain screamed at me to stay calm and not set him off further. He was working himself up, and I needed to redirect this before his anger turned into something physical. I jumped in quickly and suggested we try a fresh start, that maybe we both needed to reset the energy in here. I proposed we stay quiet for exactly 5 minutes, no talking at all, just sitting and breathing and letting everything settle. Parker stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him considering whether this was another trick. Finally, he agreed, but said, I better not try anything during the silence. I promised I wouldn't, and we both sat back against our respective walls. I pulled out my phone and set a timer for 5 minutes, showing him the screen so he knew I was being honest about the time. The quiet felt heavy and strange after all the talking, and I used it to think through my options without having to perform constant engagement with him. My mind kept circling back to that emergency stop toggle behind the panel, trying to figure out if there was any way to reach it. During the third minute of silence, I slowly reached up and touched my left ear, pretending to adjust my earring. I worked the backing off carefully and palmed the small metal post in my hand. The post was thin and straight with a dull point. Not ideal for what I wanted to do, but better than nothing. I shifted my position slightly so my body blocked Parker's view of my right hand, then reached toward the bottom corner of the control panel where I'd seen one of the screws. The screw head was tiny and the earring post wasn't the right shape for it. But I angled the post into the groove and applied gentle pressure while turning. The screw moved maybe a quarter turn before the post slipped out. I tried again, working slowly and carefully, and managed to get the screw to turn another half rotation. My fingers started cramping from holding the small post at the right angle and pressing hard enough to get traction. I got the screw maybe halfway out before my hand hurt too much to continue and I had to stop. Parker's voice cut through the quiet asking what I was doing with my hands. My timer still showed 90 seconds left, but he'd obviously been watching me the whole time. I dropped my hand away from the panel immediately and launched into a story about my mom's Sunday dinners, talking fast about how she always made way too much food and sent me home with containers full of leftovers. I described her pot roast recipe in detail, mentioning the carrots and potatoes and how she insisted on using fresh herbs from her garden. Parker's expression softened a bit as I talked, and I could see him getting pulled into the normalcy of the story. I kept going until my phone timer finally went off, then stopped talking and looked at him expectantly. He said that was nice, hearing about my mom's cooking, and I nodded and smiled like we were having a pleasant conversation instead of him holding me prisoner. I took a breath and told Parker I wanted to hug him, that I thought it might help reset our connection and show I was really trying here. I made my voice soft and sincere, like I genuinely wanted the physical contact. He stood up fast, too eager, and I got to my feet more slowly. We met in the middle of the elevator and I stepped into his arms, forcing myself not to tense up when he wrapped them around me. I shifted my weight and pressed my hip against his right side where I knew the key was, feeling the hard shape of it through his pocket fabric. I mapped the exact angle and depth, noting that the key sat vertically with the teeth pointing down. The pocket seemed deep and the key had settled near the bottom. I memorized every detail while keeping my breathing steady, and my body relaxed against him. After maybe 10 seconds, I stepped back and thanked him, saying that helped. We both sat down again, but I'd positioned myself closer to his corner this time, maybe 4 feet away instead of across the whole elevator. I waited about 2 minutes and then made my move. I reached toward his pocket slowly, trying to make it look casual, and got my fingers on the key's edge. I lifted it carefully and had it maybe halfway out of his pocket when his hand shot down and grabbed my wrist hard. We struggled for just a second, him trying to push my hand away and me trying to keep hold of the key. Pain shot up my arm where his fingers dug into my skin, and I yelped without meaning to. The key slipped from my grip and fell back into his pocket. I froze completely and held my hands up in surrender. My voice came out shaking when I apologized and told him I just wanted to feel the weight of the key, to understand him better through the object that meant so much to him. The excuse sounded weak even to my own ears, but I needed to say something. The physical struggle had made everything feel more dangerous and real, and I could see in his eyes that he knew exactly what I'd been trying to do. My wrist throbbed where he'd grabbed it, and I knew there would be bruises. Parker shoved the key deeper into his pocket, and his face showed barely controlled anger. He told me that was a really stupid thing to do, and I'd just lost his trust completely. I could see him reconsidering everything, like he was deciding whether his original plan for tonight was even worth it anymore. His jaw was tight, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The air in the elevator felt different now, heavier and more dangerous, and I knew I'd just made my situation significantly worse. I took a breath and tried to make my voice sound calmer than I felt, telling Parker that I'd read about how some counties have text to 911 systems now for emergencies when you can't make calls. I said it casually, like I was just making conversation, but really I wanted to see if he knew my text might have gotten through earlier. Parker laughed, not a friendly sound, and told me he specifically chose this spot in the building because it's a dead zone where phone signals don't reach. He explained how he'd tested it multiple times to make sure, walking around with his own phone and mapping exactly where the signal cut out. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral, knowing my phone was still recording every word he said, and this was him admitting he'd planned everything. I suggested we try some meditation breathing to help us both calm down after what just happened with the key. Parker looked suspicious, but I started demonstrating the breathing pattern, making it look like I was genuinely trying to reset things between us. As I breathed in and out slowly, I shifted my position on the floor, moving myself directly underneath the ceiling smoke detector. The small white circle was maybe 3 feet above my head, and I kept my movements gradual, so Parker wouldn't realize what I was doing. I reached into my purse slowly and pulled out my vanilla perfume, the aerosol can feeling solid in my hand. I held it up and sprayed a short burst toward the ceiling, then waited a few seconds before doing it again. Parker was watching me, but he seemed confused rather than alarmed. probably thinking I was just refreshing my perfume because I was stressed. I sprayed a third time, aiming the mist directly at the smoke detector and then a fourth burst right after. The detector suddenly made a sharp beeping sound, and then the building alarm started blaring faintly through the elevator shaft. The emergency lights in the elevator changed to a flashing red pattern, and I could hear the alarm screaming through the walls around us. Parker's face went white and he lunged toward the control panel, probably trying to find some way to silence the alarm or make it look like an accident. I threw myself between him and the panel, wedging my body against the wall so he couldn't reach the buttons. He grabbed my shoulders and tried to push me aside, but I locked my knees and pressed harder against the wall. We struggled while the alarm kept screaming above us, his hands digging into my arms as he tried to move me. Through the elevator doors, I started hearing distant voices and the sound of feet moving fast in the stairwell. The building was responding to the fire alarm, and that meant someone would check the elevators soon to make sure nobody was trapped. Parker's grip on me loosened as he realized what was happening, and he backed away from the panel, his breathing fast and panicked. He started talking out loud, like he was practicing what he'd say, telling himself he'd explain that we just got stuck, and I freaked out and accidentally set off the alarm. He kept repeating different versions of the story, trying to find one that made him sound innocent, but his voice was shaking and desperate. I moved away from the control panel and got as close to the crack in the elevator doors as I could, pressing my face against the gap. I shouted as loud as my voice would go, giving our building address and floor location, then both our full names, then the words illegal camera, and he trapped me. My throat hurt from screaming, but I kept repeating the information over and over, making sure anyone nearby would hear. A voice finally responded from somewhere in the stairwell, telling me to stay calm and that help was coming. I kept shouting details about Parker's surveillance and the camera at my mom's house until I heard heavy footsteps getting closer. The fire crew arrived and I heard metal tools scraping against the elevator doors as they started prying them open. Parker stood frozen against the back wall of the elevator, not moving or speaking anymore, just staring at the doors as they slowly separated. The gap widened and I saw Will Cameron, a day shift security supervisor I recognized from the lobby, appear in the opening. The alarm finally reset to silence and the only sound was the fire crew's equipment and my own ragged breathing as the doors opened wide enough for me to escape. I pushed through the gap and grabbed the fire crew captain's arm. My mother needs a welfare check right now. I gave her address and said she's diabetic and alone. The captain, whose name tag read Megan Larson, nodded and spoke into her radio while guiding me onto the landing. I could hear Parker moving behind me in the elevator, but I kept my eyes forward and focused on getting away from him. Will Cameron, the security supervisor I recognized from morning shifts, stepped between me and the elevator opening. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened the photo of Parker's security badge. "I need to show you something," I said, and started explaining about the audio recording I'd made during the whole thing. Parker's voice cut through from inside the elevator, talking over me and saying I was confused and upset. Will held up one hand toward the elevator and told Parker to step back and stay quiet. I showed Will the photo and started the audio playback on my phone, my finger hovering over the volume button. The recording picked up Parker's voice clearly, talking about watching my mother's house and installing the camera, and knowing her medical routine. Will's face changed as he listened, and he asked me to stop the recording and save it. Police officers appeared at the top of the stairwell, responding to the building alarm, and Will waved them over immediately. 2 officers approached, and Will gave them a quick summary while pointing at Parker still standing in the elevator. The officers moved past me and told Parker to step out slowly with his hands visible. I watched them guide him to the far end of the hallway, away from me and the fire crew. One officer stayed with Parker while the other came back to talk to Will and me. The reality of what almost happened started hitting me in waves and my legs felt weak. I sat down on the floor with my back against the wall because standing seemed impossible. The officer asked if I was injured and I touched my neck where Parker had put his hand, feeling tender spots that hurt when I pressed them. An EMS team arrived and one of them, a guy named Reed Bowers according to his uniform, knelt down next to me. He asked permission to check me over and I nodded. Reed examined my neck and found visible bruising and tenderness where Parker had touched me. He asked about transport to the hospital, but I refused, saying I just needed to get to my mother. Reed said he understood but asked to do a full evaluation and document everything first. He took photos of the bruising from multiple angles while explaining what he was doing. A detective showed up and introduced herself as Hannah Ross. She asked if I could give a preliminary statement right there while everything was fresh in my mind. I walked her through the whole night, from Parker entering the elevator to the alarm finally bringing help. Hannah listened without interrupting and took notes on a small tablet. When I finished, she asked about the audio recording and photo on my phone. I showed her both, and she asked if she could take my phone to preserve the evidence. The idea of giving up my phone made me panic because I needed it to check on my mother, but Hannah explained the chain of custody process and gave me a receipt. She promised to get it back to me within 48 hours and said I could use her phone to make any urgent calls. Will's radio crackled, and I heard someone reporting back about the welfare check on my mother. The responding officer said she answered the door slowly, but was okay, and Grace the neighbor was staying on the phone with him until I could get there. Hearing that my mother was safe broke something loose in my chest, and I started crying with relief. Hannah handed me tissues from her jacket pocket and waited while I pulled myself together. I asked to use her phone and called Grace, who answered immediately. Grace said my mother was fine but worried about me, and the officer was still there making sure everything was secure. I told Grace I was on my way and would be there in 20 minutes. I handed the phone back to Hannah and she gave me her card with her direct number. She said she'd be in touch tomorrow for a full statement and asked me to write down everything I remembered as soon as possible. I promised I would and stood up on wobbly legs. Reed offered to walk me to my car, but I said I could manage. The drive to my mother's house passed in a blur of streetlights and stop signs. I barely remembered the route even though I'd driven it hundreds of times. When I pulled up to her house, the police car was still parked out front, and I saw the officer standing on the porch talking to Grace. I got out and Grace pulled me into a hug that lasted a long time. My mother appeared in the doorway looking confused and scared, and I went to her and held her hand. The officer asked a few questions to confirm I was who I said I was, then told us to call if we needed anything else. Grace stayed for another hour, making tea and sitting with us in the living room. I explained what happened in the elevator, leaving out the worst details because I didn't want to scare them more. My mother kept touching my face and asking if I was really okay. I sat with her through the rest of the night, dozing on her couch while she slept upstairs. Detective Ross called twice for updates and I answered questions while trying to keep my voice down. I also had to call the building management emergency line to file an incident report, and that conversation took another 30 minutes of explaining everything again. My brain felt fuzzy and disconnected, like I was watching everything happen to someone else instead of living it myself. The next morning, I waited until 9 o'clock and called the building operations office. I got an appointment with Craig Blackwell, the operations manager, for that afternoon. Craig met me in a conference room and had a laptop open with security system logs displayed. He showed me the elevator records from last night and pointed to timestamps showing when Parker manually stopped the elevator between floors. The logs also showed him disabling the emergency call system right after the stop. Craig printed copies of everything and put them in a folder for me to give to the police. He apologized multiple times and said the building was taking this extremely seriously. An IT specialist named Jillian Huang joined us, and Craig asked her to explain what she'd found. Jillian had traced the illegal camera feed from across the street from my mother's house back to equipment registered under Parker's security credentials. She showed me timestamps proving he'd been monitoring the feed for over a month, with regular check-ins during his night shifts. The evidence kept piling up and each new piece made me feel sick all over again. I took all the documents and drove straight to the courthouse. The clerk at the restraining order office gave me forms to fill out and explained the process. I wrote down everything that happened and attached copies of the building logs and camera evidence. The clerk reviewed my paperwork and scheduled a hearing for later in the week. She explained that Parker would be served with a temporary order immediately and would have to stay away from me and my mother until the hearing. Walking out of the courthouse, I felt strange, like I was moving through someone else's life instead of my own. The next morning, Will Cameron called me at work and asked if I could come down to the security office during my lunch break. I took the elevator down with my stomach in knots the whole ride, but Will was waiting in the lobby and walked with me to his office on the second floor. He had a folder on his desk with Parker's employee file and explained that the security company was starting the process to fire Parker. The union rep had been called and there would be meetings and paperwork, but Will promised Parker wouldn't be allowed back in the building while everything got sorted out. I asked if Parker could still access the security systems remotely, and Will showed me logs proving all of Parker's credentials had been shut off within an hour of the police taking him away. Seeing those access revoked timestamps made me feel slightly safer, like at least one door had been locked behind me. 2 days later, Detective Ross called while I was grocery shopping, and I had to pull over in the parking lot to take notes. She told me the prosecutor was charging Parker with unlawful watching and false prison, which sounded too simple for what he'd done, but apparently those were the legal terms that fit. Parker had posted bail that morning with conditions including a GPS ankle monitor and orders not to contact me or my mother, or come within 500 feet of either of our addresses. Hearing that he was out walking around somewhere made my hands shake, so hard I could barely hold my phone. Detective Ross gave me a case number and told me to call immediately if Parker violated any of the conditions, then reminded me about victim services and support resources before hanging up. I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to calm down enough to drive home. That weekend, I made an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Sarah Anderson, who worked with people dealing with scary situations. The first session was harder than I expected because talking about the elevator made everything feel real again, instead of like a bad dream I could forget. I had to describe what happened while Dr. Anderson took notes, and when I got to the part about Parker's hand on my neck, I started crying and couldn't stop for a while. But Dr. Anderson didn't rush me or make me feel weird about it. She just waited and then taught me some breathing tricks for when my heart started racing. She explained that my brain was stuck in alarm mode after what happened, which was why I kept checking over my shoulder and couldn't sleep well. We made a plan for managing the constant worry, and she gave me a worksheet to track when I felt most scared during the day. Walking out of that first appointment, I felt tired, but also a little bit hopeful that maybe I could learn to feel normal again. The next evening, I drove to my mother's house and we sat at her kitchen table with Grace to talk about safety. My mother kept insisting she was fine and didn't need help, but I pulled up the police report on my phone showing how Parker had been watching her house for over a month. Her face went pale when she saw the timestamps of him checking the camera feed during her bedtime routine. Grace held my mother's hand while I explained that we needed to set up better systems to keep her protected. We agreed to get a medical alert button that my mother could wear on her wrist, the kind that calls for help if she falls or has a medical problem. Grace would keep doing her evening check-in calls like always, and we'd hire someone to visit 3 times a week to help my mother remember her medications and check her blood sugar levels. My mother cried a little while signing the paperwork for the alert system, but she admitted she'd been scared ever since the police told her about the camera. Installing everything took most of the weekend, but by Sunday night my mother had her button programmed, and the aid service had scheduled their first visit for Tuesday morning. A week later, Craig Blackwell called me into another meeting at the building to talk about changes they were making. He brought Jillian Huang from IT, and they walked me through new rules requiring 2 people to approve any elevator override and regular checks of all the camera systems. Jillian showed me a new monitoring alert that would text multiple managers if an elevator stopped for more than 2 minutes, which meant what happened to me couldn't happen again without people knowing right away. Craig apologized again and said the building was taking this seriously, and while I appreciated the changes, I also felt angry that it took me getting trapped for them to fix obvious problems. But at least future people would be safer, which was something. The restraining order hearing happened on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the elevator incident. I had to sit in a courtroom while Parker sat on the other side with his lawyer, and seeing him again made my stomach hurt, even though 2 bailiffs were standing right there. The judge read through all the evidence, including the recordings and photos and building logs, then asked Parker's lawyer if he wanted to say anything. The lawyer mentioned that Parker was entering a treatment program as part of discussions about a plea deal, which felt like he was trying to make Parker sound less dangerous. But the judge granted a full 1-year restraining order with GPS monitoring and strict rules about Parker staying away from me and my mother and the building where I work. Parker had to sign paperwork agreeing to all of it. And when I walked out of the courthouse, I felt like I could finally breathe a little bit deeper. 3 weeks after the elevator night, I rode in an elevator with my coworker Jennifer for the first time since everything happened. My hands shook the entire ride from the lobby up to our floor, and I kept staring at the emergency button. But I made myself do it because Dr. Anderson said avoiding elevators forever would make the fear bigger. I had a detailed safety plan saved in my phone's notes that listed exactly what to do if an elevator stopped, including using the emergency call button and texting 911 and making noise so people would hear. Jennifer knew what happened and stood close to me during the ride without making a big deal about it, and when we reached our floor, I felt proud of myself for doing something scary. That weekend, I visited my mother for dinner, and we went through her new routine together to make sure everything was working right. She showed me the medical alert button on her wrist and how she'd tested it that morning, and we checked that Grace's number was posted on the fridge along with the aid's schedule by the door. Everything felt more secure now, even though I knew security was partly fake, just something that made us feel better rather than a real promise that nothing bad would happen. But my mother seemed calmer, and that mattered more than perfect safety. On the walk home from my mother's house, I opened my phone and scrolled back to find the draft panic texts I'd written that night in the elevator. There were 5 of them, all unsent because my signal had been blocked, each one more desperate than the last. I read through them once to remember how scared I'd been, and how I'd survived anyway despite feeling certain I wouldn't make it out. Then I selected all 5 drafts and hit delete, watching them disappear from my message list because I didn't need them anymore.